The water is the color of nothing, not blue, not gray, not even black, just nothing. An absence so complete, so total, that it stretches in every direction until your eyes give up trying to find where it ends. The sun has been up for 4 hours, and already it feels like a brand pressed against the back of your neck. Your lips cracked weeks ago. You've stopped remembering exactly when, because pain, after long enough, stops being an event. It becomes the air you breathe. You are floating inside a broken fiberglass boat, roughly the size of a large pickup truck. Around you, a dead engine, tangled ropes, and the bones of a fish you caught 3 days ago. Or was it 4? The Pacific Ocean doesn't care about your counting. The Pacific Ocean doesn't care about anything. You talk to yourself. You talk to the fish you haven't caught yet. You talk to God in Spanish, and then you apologize for the things you say next. You are 36 years old. You have a daughter you haven't seen in years, and somewhere, at a distance you cannot calculate, there is a shore, any shore, that you will either reach or you won't. What no one will believe when this is over is how long over takes to arrive. His name is Salvador Alvarenga. And what happened to him over the next 438 days is not just a survival story. It is something far darker, far stranger, and far more human than that. Salvador was born somewhere around 1975 or 1977 in El Salvador. Even he isn't entirely certain of the year. That detail alone tells you something about the kind of childhood he had. He grew up poor, in the kind of poverty that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It just quietly removes options, one by one, until you end up on the Pacific coast of Mexico, working as a deep-sea fisherman in a small village called Costa Azul, near the port town of Pijijiapan. He was stocky, strong, sun-darkened. He had a laugh people described as generous, the kind of laugh that fills a room and makes strangers feel like they've known you for years. And by any professional measure, he was extraordinary at what he did. Deep-sea shark fishing off the Mexican coast is not a hobby. It is not an adventure. It is a brutal, dangerous profession that requires reading the ocean the way a doctor reads a patient, with patience, precision, and complete respect for what can go wrong. Salvador had been doing this for years. The ocean was not a mystery to him. It was his workplace. He knew its moods, its rhythms, its warnings. He thought he knew its limits. He had a daughter, Fatima, living with his parents back in El Salvador. He sent money when he could. He planned to go back someday, when there was enough saved. Fishermen always plan to go back someday. That is perhaps the most dangerous sentence a fisherman can say to himself. In November of 2012, Salvador's employer paired him with a new deckhand. The young man's name was Ezequiel Cordoba. He was 22 years old, freshly arrived from an inland state, and had almost no fishing experience. He was nervous and eager, and a little seasick. Salvador found him annoying at first, and then, in the way that happens when two people are stuck together in close quarters, quietly endearing. The plan for their November trip was textbook. Head out roughly 100 miles offshore. Set lines for shark and dorado. Return within 2 days. They had done versions of this trip dozens of times. The weather forecast showed some wind, but nothing unmanageable. What they didn't know, what no one on shore thought to check closely enough, was that the wind wasn't going to stop. It started as a nuisance. 12 hours out from shore, the swells began building. Not dramatically at first, just that subtle shift in rhythm where the boat stops gliding and starts climbing. Over and over, each wave a little steeper than the last. Salvador watched the horizon and said nothing. Ezequiel watched Salvador's face and said nothing. This is how experienced fishermen communicate concern, through what they don't say. By nightfall, the engine was struggling, not failing, struggling. A distinction that matters enormously, because struggling gives you hope, and hope makes you stay out longer than you should. Salvador turned back. He pointed the boat toward the coast, pushed the throttle, and the engine answered, weakly, reluctantly. And for a few hours, he actually believed they were making progress. They weren't. The storm had grown into something the Mexican Meteorological Service would later classify as a severe weather event. It was pushing them faster than any engine could pull them. For every mile they clawed toward shore, the current took back 2. By 3 a.m. on November 18th, the engine overheated, seized, and died. Salvador tried everything. He checked fuel lines, he bled the system, he let it cool and tried again. The engine made a sound like something giving up, and then it made no sound at all. This was the moment that changed everything. Not a dramatic crash, not a single catastrophic event. Just a dead engine, a building storm, and 2 men inside a 25-foot fiberglass boat called La Champa, drifting northwest into the open Pacific at roughly 2 knots. 2 knots doesn't sound fast, but in the wrong direction, on the wrong ocean, 2 knots is plenty. Ezequiel began to cry. Salvador didn't. He looked at the sky, at the dead engine, at the boy beside him. And he made a decision. Throw the shark catch overboard to lighten the boat, lash everything down, and wait out the storm. The radio was working. Someone would come. No one came. Here is something most people don't know about this story, something that adds a weight to it that the ocean itself couldn't provide. A search was launched. Mexican Coast Guard stations picked up fragments of what may have been their distress call. Search aircraft were deployed. Ships scanned the surface. For 3 days, people looked for Salvador and Ezequiel, and then, on day 3, the search was called off. Not because they were found, not because there was any confirmed evidence of death, simply because the search zone, based on their last known position, had been covered. And in weather that severe, the assumption was grim and final. Ezequiel's mother, Maria Cordoba, was told her son was missing. That single word, missing, would haunt her for over a year. Salvador didn't know the search had been called off. He would spend the next several weeks still believing that someone was looking, still firing flares into empty sky, still listening to the radio for any voice. That faith, that stubborn, incorrect faith, is both heartbreaking and, in its own strange way, essential. Because hope, even misplaced hope, kept him moving when logic would have told him to stop. He started fishing. Ezequiel was not built for this. That is not a judgment. Most human beings are not built for what they now faced. But the 22-year-old had no reserves to draw on. No mental framework for what happens when all frameworks fail. In the first week, he ate almost nothing. His body simply wouldn't allow it. Shock, fear, and seasickness had locked him shut. By the second week, he had begun to sleep longer and speak less. Salvador recognized this pattern. He had seen it before, in men who had given up before they knew they were giving up. He tried everything to keep Ezequiel present. He taught him to fish. He told stories. He invented small tasks. Monitor the water supply, watch for ships. Because purpose, even artificial purpose, is a kind of anchor to the living world. But Ezequiel was drifting somewhere Salvador couldn't follow. Here is one of the most haunting facts of this entire story. Salvador had developed a brutal but effective system for survival. Seabirds could be grabbed by hand when they landed on the bow at night. Their blood, drunk immediately, provided hydration. Their flesh, dried on the railing in strips, provided protein. Sea turtles could be caught when they surfaced to sleep, a technique requiring patience and a slow, meditative calm that seemed almost sacred in its quietness. It was ugly. It was primitive. It was absolutely necessary. Ezekiel refused to eat these things. He said the food was wrong. He said he wanted rice. He began saying things that stopped making sense. Salvador ate. Ezekiel didn't. And so the arithmetic became brutal. Around day 60, Ezekiel stopped responding entirely. Not metaphorically. The boy would open his eyes when Salvador spoke. He would sometimes nod, but he was no longer fully present. Whatever thread had kept him connected to the world of the living had frayed down to almost nothing. Salvador sat beside him for hours. He described food they would eat when they got home. He described the bus ride from whatever coast they hit to the nearest city. He described cold beer, the specific brand, the exact temperature, the sensation of condensation on the bottle. Ezekiel died sometime in mid-January 2013. Salvador held him for a long time before doing what he knew he had to do. He said a prayer, a full one, not fragmented. He told the boy he was sorry for every impatience, every frustration. He asked him to forgive the ocean, which he knew was a strange thing to ask of someone who was already gone. Then he put Ezekiel into the Pacific and watched him sink. He was alone now, completely, utterly, finally alone. And somewhere, still, impossibly, there was a shore he had promised to reach. Here is where this story gets strange. Around day 28, before Ezekiel's death, when both men were still aboard, a whale surfaced alongside La Champa. Not dangerously close, just close enough that Salvador could have reached out and touched it if he dared. A humpback, he believed, though he was no marine biologist. It moved at the same drift speed as the boat. It stayed for nearly an hour. Occasionally it released breath from its blowhole in those enormous, slow sighs that sound, if you're close enough and desperate enough for company, almost like conversation. As Salvador talked to it, he said this himself later, without embarrassment or irony. He told the whale things he hadn't said out loud since the journey began. He told it about Fatima. He told it he was tired. He told it he was not going to die out here because he had someone to go back to, and he needed the whale to understand that. To witness that declaration, the whale dove. It didn't come back. But something in Salvador had shifted. Something had solidified. From that point forward, his survival was no longer reactive. It became systematic. He built a water collection system from plastic bags, capturing up to a liter of rainwater per storm. He dried fish on the hull methodically. He slept in controlled intervals to preserve energy. He rationed not based on hunger, but based on calculation. By day 50, he had drifted approximately 1,200 miles from where the engine had died. He didn't know this. He had no GPS, no map, no compass that could help him. He only knew one thing. This day, survive. Around day 90, a cargo vessel passed close enough that Salvador could see the lights on its bridge. He waved. He screamed. He threw everything he could lift. He lit what little he had left that could burn. He did every human thing a person does when they see salvation passing at 15 knots, 200 meters away. The ship didn't stop. Whether they saw him and dismissed him as floating debris, or simply never saw him at all, he never found out. He watched the lights shrink. He watched them disappear. And then he sat down in the bottom of La Champa, and he did not speak for 2 full days. That silence, that 48-hour collapse, was the closest Salvador Alvarenga came to not going on. What pulled him back was not a vision, not a divine intervention, not a dramatic realization. It was the mundane image of Fatima's face, the specific, ordinary way she looked when she was concentrating on something. the private intimacy of a detail only a parent would know. He had not seen her in years. He owed her, at minimum, the attempt to return. He started fishing again in the morning. By the time Salvador had been at sea for 4 months, his body had become something the human form was never designed to be. He had lost approximately 70 pounds. His muscles had wasted to the point where his skeleton was redefining the shape of his skin. His hair had grown long and matted into something unrecognizable. His teeth ached. His joints had swollen and then, inexplicably, shrunk. His skin had been burned, then scarred, then burned again, layer after layer of damage accumulating into something that no longer looked quite human. Medical researchers who later studied his case noted something remarkable. His organs, despite everything, had not failed. His kidneys showed stress markers but were functioning. His liver had held. His heart had not given up. The human body, when stripped of everything else, will attempt to survive far beyond the point where the mind has any rational reason to continue encouraging it. Salvador talked to keep his mind intact. He talked to fish he hadn't caught yet. He talked to birds that landed long enough to be caught and eaten. He talked to the stars, giving them names because naming things preserves the human habit of making meaning. And meaning, in the absence of everything else, is a kind of food. He entered a territory that survival research almost never covers, because most survival situations end, one way or another, long before they reach this point. Salvador was in uncharted psychological water, and the fact that he remained fundamentally himself throughout is perhaps the most extraordinary element of the entire ordeal. January 30th, 2014, 438 days after La Champa's engine died. An atoll appeared on the horizon. Salvador had trained himself over months not to trust what he saw. The Pacific plays tricks. Heat and desperation manufacture coastlines that dissolve when you blink. He watched it. It didn't disappear. He watched it longer. It stayed. Abon Atoll, the southernmost point of the Marshall Islands. Population, approximately 1,000 people. Located roughly 5,500 miles from where his engine had died. He had no paddle. He had no engine. What he had was a current, the angle of the wind, and, for perhaps the first time in 438 days, geography conspiring in his favor. La Champa drifted toward the atoll over the course of an entire day. Slowly, measurably, undeniably. On the island, 2 local men, Ola Fjellstad and Russell Leikidrik, noticed an unfamiliar vessel drifting toward shore. They paddled out to investigate. This is the kind of ordinary human instinct. Let me go check that. That, in the right moment, changes everything. What they found when they pulled alongside La Champa was a man who had difficulty forming words. He was speaking, Spanish mostly, with fragments of a private shorthand that had developed over 14 months of talking only to himself. He was alive in the technical sense that all his systems were still operating. He could not stand unassisted. Ola Fjellstad later said, "I thought it was a zombie." Salvador thought, in those first seconds of contact, that he had finally dreamed so hard he'd crossed a line he couldn't come back from. He reached out and touched the side of their boat. It was solid. He touched it again. He said, in Spanish, "I came from Mexico." They flew him to Majuro, the capital of the Marshall Islands, where doctors found him to be, in their own medical language, something close to impossible. 70 pounds lost, kidneys stressed, skin damaged beyond easy categorization, muscles partially wasted, and yet alive, organs functioning, mind. And when tested by researchers who were initially skeptical of his entire account, intact. The recovery took months. He returned eventually to El Salvador, where he was reunited with his family, with Fatima, The daughter whose face had kept him fishing through the gray weeks when everything else ran out. The reunion, by his own account, was not the Hollywood moment people hoped for. It was complicated and quiet and difficult in ways that can't be undone by one conversation. He had been gone for too long. She had grown up without him in ways that time alone could not repair. He was a survivor. He was also, in certain important ways, a stranger. Both things were true at the same time, and he was honest enough to say so. Ezequiel Cordoba's mother, Maria Cordoba, received the news of her son's death. She then did something remarkable. She turned her grief into action. She began publicly advocating for better safety regulations for small fishing vessels along Mexico's Pacific coast. Mandatory emergency beacons, clearer protocols when searches are called off, better communication between crews and coastguard stations. Some of those reforms were eventually adopted. Not enough, by most accounts, but some. Somewhere, a fisherman who doesn't know Ezekiel's name is safer because a mother refused to let her son's death mean nothing. There is something about the Pacific Ocean that resists the meaning-making we like to attach to stories like this. It didn't want to kill Salvador Alvarenga. It didn't want anything. It moved the way it has moved for millennia, driven by currents that were running long before any fisherman climbed into any boat. It didn't break his engine with malice. A storm did that. And storms don't have intentions either. And yet, 438 days. A dead engine. A boy who didn't make it. A whale that stayed for an hour. A daughter's face in the middle of the gray Pacific. A green line on the horizon that refused to be a mirage. A man who talked to fish and birds and stars. Not because he believed they could answer, but because talking is how human beings maintain the sense that they still exist. We like to say that survival stories prove something magnificent about the human spirit, about courage, about willpower, about some special quality that separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't. But what Salvador's story actually proves is quieter and harder to frame, that the will to return to ordinary life, to rice, to cold beer, to a daughter's face while she concentrates, can outlast almost anything the extraordinary throws at it. Not the will to be heroic, not the will to be remembered, just the will to go home. He came from Mexico. He arrived in the Marshall Islands 438 days later. And somewhere between those 2 points, across 5,500 miles of open water and more days of impossible endurance than most people can even count, he remained stubbornly, unremarkably, completely himself. And that, when you think about it, might be the most remarkable thing of all. If this story stayed with you, if it changed even slightly how you think about what human beings are capable of, hit like and subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered, and the people who live them deserve to be more than a footnote. I'll see you in the next one.